Chapter 16, continued. At that moment, however, pandemonium broke loose. The Kinshasan envoys reached into their elaborate headdresses and withdrew wooden knives, which had passed the metal detectors in the frisking, and rushed toward the throne. The guards fired quickly, their lasers dropping 5 of the Kinshasans, but all had aimed at the foremost assassins, and 3 continued unharmed. They raced on toward the throne, arms extended so the knives were already aimed directly at McCall's heart. There were shouts and screams. A guard managed to shift his aim and get off a shot, but it was wild, and the others had exhausted their charges on the first shot. They were struggling to recharge their lasers, but knew even as they tried that they would be too late, that nothing would be fast enough to stop the wooden knives from reaching McCall. McCall looked death in the eye, and did not seem disappointed. But at that moment Ansett threw the wine goblet at one of the attackers, and then leaped out in front of the Emperor. He jumped easily into the air, and kicked the jaw of the first of the attackers. The angle of the kick was perfect, the force sharp and incredibly hard, and the Kinshasan's head flew 50 feet away into the crowd, as his body slid forward, until the wooden knife, still clutched in his hand, touched McCall's foot. Ansett came down from the jump in time to bring his hand upward into the abdomen of another attacker so sharply that his arm was buried to the elbow in bowels, and his fingers crushed the man's heart. The third attacker paused just a moment, thrown from his relentless charge by the sudden onslaught from the child who had stood so harmlessly by the Emperor's throne. That pause was long enough for recharged lasers to be aimed, to flash, and the last Kinshasan assassin fell, dropping ashes as he collapsed, flaming slightly. The whole thing, from the appearance of the wooden knives to the fall of the last attacker, had taken 5 seconds. Ansett stood still in the middle of the hall, entrails on his arm, blood splashed all over his body. He looked at the gory hand, at the body he had pulled it out of. A rush of long-blocked memories came back, and he remembered other such bodies, other heads kicked from torsos, other men who had died as Ansett learned the skill of killing with his hands. The guilt that had troubled him when he awakened in the evenings on the boat swept through him now with greater force than ever, for now he knew why he felt it, what the guilt was for. The searches had all been in vain. The precautions were meaningless. Ansett could not have used a weapon, did not need a weapon. Ansett was the weapon that was to have been used against Father McCall. The smell of blood and broken intestines, combined with the emotions sweeping his body. He would have vomited, longed to vomit, but control asserted itself. It had been instilled in him for such unbearable moments as this, and he stood, his face an impassive mask, waiting. The guards approached him carefully, unsure what they should do. But the Chamberlain was sure. Ansett heard the voice, trembling with fear at how close the assassination had come, and how close McCall had been to assassination ever since Ansett had been restored to him, as the Chamberlain shouted, "Keep him under guard! Watch him! Never let him be out of a laser's aim for a moment! Then bring him to the council chamber in an hour!" The guards looked toward McCall, white-faced and shaken on the throne, and he nodded to them. Chapter 17. McCall sat staring into the fire, remembering the first man he had ever killed. McCall had been a mere child, only 10, younger than Ansett. No, mustn't think of Ansett. Only 10, and upstairs asleep. It was in the years of terror, on the worlds of the Helping Walk, and that night it was their turn. There was no knock on the door, no sound outside, just the crash of the door blowing in, the scream of McCall's mother, who had not yet gone to bed, the shriek of McCall's sister as she awakened across the small room from him. McCall had not had to wonder what it was. He was only 10, but such things could not be kept from children in those years, and he had seen the women's corpses, taken apart and strewn along the street, had seen the male genitals nailed to the walls as the corpse of the man who had owned them leaned below them, leering madly at the fire that had turned his bowels to ashes. The marauders traveled in small groups, and were said to be irresistible, but McCall knew where the hunting gun was kept, and how to aim it true. He found it in his parents' room, loaded it carefully while his mother kept on screaming downstairs, and then waited patiently while 2 sets of footsteps came up the stairs. He would have only 1 shot, but if he chose the right moment it would be enough. The gun was strong enough to shove a charge through one man and kill another behind him. The men loomed at the top of the stairs. McCall had no angst at the thought of killing. He fired. The recoil of the gun knocked him down. When he got up, the 2 men were gone, having tumbled down the stairs. Still, his poise did not leave him. He loaded again, then walked carefully to the top of the stairs. At the bottom, 2 men knelt over the corpses, then looked up. If McCall had hesitated, they would have killed him. Lasers are quicker than any projectile, and these men knew how to use them. But McCall did not hesitate. He fired again, and this time held his ground against the recoil, watching as the 2 men dropped from the explosion as the shell hit one man in the head. It was a lucky shot. McCall had been aiming for the other man's belly. It made no difference. Both were dead. McCall did not know how he would get down the stairs under fire to finish off the rest, but he intended to try. It turned out that he didn't need to. His father was being held, forced to watch as the second man began raping his wife. When 4 of the marauders were suddenly dead, McCall's father didn't hesitate to tell the other 3, "You haven't got a chance. There are 4 of them upstairs and another dozen outside." They believed him, but they were marauders, and so slit his throat to the bone and stabbed McCall's mother 8 times. And only then did they turn their lasers on themselves, knowing that there would be no mercy if they surrendered, not even a trial, just the brief ceremony of tearing them to pieces. McCall's father died even as they did, but McCall's mother lived. And at the age of 10, McCall became something of a hero. He organized the villages into a strong, resisting force, and when the word spread that no marauders could get into that village, other villages pleaded with McCall to lead them, too, though he was just a child. By the age of 15, he had forced the marauders to accept a treaty that, in essence, kept them from landing on McCall's planet, and over the next few years, McCall taught them that he had the power and the will to enforce it. Yet in the moments when he first came downstairs and saw the 4 men he had killed, saw his father gouting blood through the gaping smile in his throat, saw 3 charred corpses already stinking of half-cooked meat, saw his mother lying naked on the floor, with a knife in her breast. He had felt an agony that powered all his actions ever since. Even remembering that night left him sweating, more than a century later. And at first it had been hate that propelled him, forced him to take a fleet out to the marauders' own worlds and subdue them, brought him to be the head of a strong, tough group of men, all older than him, and willing to follow him to hell. But somewhere along the way the hate had left him. Not until after they had finally succeeded in killing his mother with poison, decades after she had survived the knives. He had hated them, surely. Perhaps it was gradual, as the night of death faded into memory, and he began to feel the responsibility of caring for the billions of people who depended on him for law, for peace, for protection. Somewhere along the way his goals had changed. He was no longer out to punish the wicked, as he had once thought his mission in life to be. Now he was out to establish peace throughout the galaxy, to protect mankind from mankind, even though it meant more bloody war to force the quarreling worlds and nations and leagues of worlds to accept what they all claimed to want, an end to death in battle. "I did it," McCall told himself, staring into the flames. "I did it. And yet, not well enough. Because after all of this, a boy had to stand there tonight, with blood on his hands, looking at the corpses of the men he had killed. I started all this so that no boy would ever have to do that again." McCall felt a pain inside himself that he could not bear. He put his hand into the fire until the pain of his body forced the pain of his heart to recede. Then he wrapped the hand, salved it, and wondered why inward wounds could not be so easily healed. Chapter 18. "Songbird," Richard Ashton said. "It seems that someone has taught you new songs." Ansett stood among the guards, who all had lasers trained on him. Control kept him from showing any emotion at all, though he longed to cry out with the agony that tore at him inside. "My walls are deep, but can they hold this?" he wondered. And inside his head he heard, faintly, a voice singing to him. It was Este's voice, and she sang the love song, and that was what allowed him to contain the guilt and the grief and the fear, and keep control. "You must have studied under a master," Richter said. "I never—" Ansett started, and then realized that he could not keep on speaking. Not, and keep control. "Don't torture the boy, Captain," said McCall, from where he sat in a corner of the council room. The Chamberlain launched into his pro forma resignation. "I should have examined the boy's muscle structure and realized what new skills he had been given. I submit my resignation. I beg you to take my life." The Chamberlain must be even more worried than usual, Ansett realized, for he had prostrated himself in front of the Emperor. "Shut up and get up," McCall said. The Chamberlain arose with his face gray. McCall had not followed the ritual. The Chamberlain's life was still on the line. "Apparently," McCall said, "we've broken through some of the barriers laid in my Songbird's mind. Let's see how many. Ansett stood watching as Richter's took a packet off the table and spread pictures for Ansett to look at. Ansett looked at the first one and felt sick. He did not know why they were making him look until he saw the third one and gasped, despite control. "You know this one," Richter said. Ansett nodded dumbly. "Point to the ones you know." So Ansett pointed to nearly half of them, and Richter's checked them against a list he held in his hands. And when Ansett was through and turned away, slowly, because the guards with the lasers were nervous, Richard smiled grimly at McCall. "He picked every single one kidnapped and murdered after he himself was kidnapped. There was a connection after all." "I killed them," Ansett said, and his voice was not calm. It shook as no one in the palace had ever heard it shake before. McCall looked at him but said nothing, gave no sign of sympathy. "They had me practice on them," Ansett finished. "Who had you practice?" Richards demanded. The voices from the box." Ansett struggled to hold on to the memory that had been hidden from him by the block. Now he knew why the block had been so strong. He could not have borne knowing what was hidden in his mind. But now it was in the open, and he had to bear it, at least long enough to tell. He had to tell, though he longed to let the block slide back to hide these memories forever. "What box?" Richter's would not let up. "The box. A wooden box. Maybe a receiver, maybe a recording. I don't know." "Did you know the voice?" "Voices. Never the same. Not even for the same sentence. The voices changed for every word. I could never find any songs in them." Ansett kept seeing the faces of the bound men he was told to maim and then kill. He remembered that though he cried out against it, he could not resist, could not stop himself. "How did they force you to do it?" Richters asked. And though his voice was soft, the questions were insistent, had to be answered. I don't know. There were words, and then I had to." "What words?" I don't know. I never knew." And Ansett began to cry. McCall spoke softly. "Who taught you to kill that way?" "A man. I never knew his name. On the last day he was tied where the others had been. The voices made me kill him." Ansett struggled with the words, the struggle made harder by the realization that, this time, when he had killed his teacher, he had not had to be forced. He had killed because he hated the man. "I murdered him." "Nonsense," the Chamberlain said, trying to sound sympathetic. "You were a tool." "I told you to shut up," McCall said curtly. "Can you remember anything else, my son?" Ansett nodded, took a breath, knowing that though he had lost the illusion of control, still it was the walls of control that kept him from screaming, from charging a guard, and dying in the welcome flame of a laser. I killed Master, and all of the crew that was there. Some were missing. The ones I recognized from the pictures from Air and Husk, but I killed all the rest. They were all in the room with the table. And all alone, I killed them. They fought me as hard as they could, all except Master, who just stood there like he couldn't believe that I could be doing what he saw me do. Maybe they never knew what it was I was learning to do on deck. And then? And then, when they were all dead, I heard footsteps of both being on the deck. Who? I don't know. The box told me to lie down on my stomach, and I did. And the box told me to close my eyes, and I did, and I couldn't open them. Then footsteps down the stairs, and a slap on my arm, and I woke up walking down a street. Everyone was silent then, for a few moments. It was the Chamberlain who finally spoke first. "My lord, it must have been the Songbird's great love for you that broke through the barriers, despite the fact that the captain was already dead." "Chamberlain!" McCall interrupted. "Your life is over if you speak again before I address you." He turned to Richter's Ashen. "Captain, I want to know how those Kinshasans got past your guard." Chapter 16. Continued. They tried that they would be too late, that nothing would be fast enough to stop the wooden knives from reaching McCall. McCall looked death in the eye, and did not seem disappointed. But at that moment Ansett threw the wine goblet at one of the attackers, and then leaped out in front of the Emperor. He jumped easily into the air, and kicked the jaw of the first of the attackers. The angle of the kick was perfect, the force sharp and incredibly hard, and the Kinshasan's head flew 50 feet away into the crowd, as his body slid forward until the wooden knife, still clutched in his hand, touched McCall's foot. Ansett came down from the jump in time to burst assassins, and 3 continued unharmed. They raced on toward the throne, arms extended so the knives were already aimed directly at McCall's heart. There were shouts and screams. A guard managed to shift his aim and get off a shot, but it was wild, and the others had exhausted their charges on the first shot. They were struggling to recharge their lasers, but knew even as they... At that moment, however, pandemonium broke loose. The Kinshasan envoys reached into their elaborate headdresses and withdrew wooden knives, which had passed the metal detectors in the frisking, and rushed toward the throne. The guards fired quickly, their lasers dropping 5 of the Kinshasans, but all had aimed at the foremost